The Convergence of Theory and Arithmetic. A comprehensive analysis of the historic Congressional Fiscal Inquiry Chapter 1. The architecture of a confrontation. The historical event in question unfolded with a level of surgical precision that one might typically associate with high-stakes laboratory experiments, occurring at the exact temporal marker of 11:34 a.m. on a standard Wednesday morning in the month of March. This specific moment was not merely a point on a calendar, but rather the singular, defining juncture where Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez encountered a formidable intellectual and practical challenge, a challenge she had successfully, and perhaps miraculously, maneuvered around or completely bypassed throughout the entirety of her high-profile, 6-year political career. The unyielding and impartial principles of fundamental mathematics. 1. The setting for this exchange was the Dirksen Senate Office Building, a structure characterized by its imposing neoclassical architecture, marble-lined corridors, and the heavy, dampening acoustics of its committee rooms. 2. These rooms, designed to facilitate the solemn business of governance, are adorned with walnut paneling and bronze lighting fixtures, creating an atmosphere that is at once majestic and oppressive. 2. It is an environment that naturally amplifies the gravity of the proceedings, stripping away the performative gloss of the digital age and leaving only the raw substance of policy and argumentation. Under the intense, unforgiving lighting of the Senate hearing room, the professional and meticulously cultivated aesthetic, the Congresswoman had made her trademark the signature red blazer, and the specific shade of lipstick suddenly took on the visual quality of a costume. 1. It appeared as if the complex reality of high-stakes governance had finally pierced the protective veil of social media stardom. It is essential to clarify that the challenge presented in this chamber was not the performative, often superficial arithmetic frequently deployed on digital social media landscapes such as X, formerly Twitter, or TikTok. In those virtual domains, complex economic variables, multi-layered fiscal policies, and nuanced social theories are frequently reduced to simplistic, populist slogans designed for rapid consumption by a base that prioritizes emotional resonance over empirical accuracy. 1. Such digital rhetoric often focuses on the perceived excess of billionaires or fluctuates job growth figures in a manner meant for viral distribution rather than academic scrutiny. Nor was this the specific variety of calculation involving unread legislative studies, obscure white papers, or the vague trillion-dollar estimates often cited in brief, high-energy video segments where numbers are tossed around like rhetorical confetti for their immediate atmospheric effect. Instead, this was objective, undeniable, and cold mathematics, the exact variety that necessitates the physical presence of a calculating device. It was the kind of arithmetic where the input must, by the very laws of logic, reconcile perfectly with the output, and where the invisible but powerful force of fiscal gravity finally exerts its unavoidable pressure on even the most lofty of political ambitions. This situation represented the kind of intense, granular scrutiny where a legislator, regardless of their charisma or public following, cannot simply rely on the rhythmic, predictable applause of a sympathetic and ideologically aligned crowd by promising to shift the entirety of the national financial burden onto the shoulders of the affluent. On the contrary, it was a direct, face-to-face encounter with a tangible, physical electronic device and a formal request from an interlocutor, one possessing a subtle, deceptively calm Southern drawl, to demonstrate the underlying work in front of a live, global television audience estimated to exceed 38 million observers. One Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man known for his sharp intellect hidden behind a veneer of rural simplicity, was positioned with poise across the witness table. He performed a physical gesture that would, within mere minutes, transition from a simple movement into an iconic piece of political history. He reached down and slid a modest $5 retail calculator, the specific variety featuring oversized, tactile buttons typically associated with basic household budgeting or elementary accounting, across the polished mahogany surface toward the Congresswoman. 1. The tactile feedback of such a device, the plastic swish and click of the buttons, stands in stark contrast to the silent, frictionless nature of digital touchscreens, serving as a grounding artifact of material reality. 5. He made this request with a demeanor that was strategically polite, almost apologetic in its tone, asking that she simply aggregate the various revenue streams intended to fully capitalize the very legislative proposals she had championed with such vigor for over half a decade. These initiatives, often framed as essential for the salvation of the national fabric and the achievement of long-overdue environmental justice, were promised to generate millions of high-paying jobs with minimal fiscal friction, all viewed through the optimistic lens of modern monetary theory. 1. As Ocasio-Cortez observed, the small plastic device moving toward her, her usual aura of unshakable confidence, seemed to undergo a visible, rapid erosion. Her hands, which are typically steady and expressive when she addresses her vast digital audience or gestures during routine committee proceedings, exhibited a slight but noticeable tremor as she reached out to accept the device. 1. This physiological reaction, the tremor of the hands, is a well-documented manifestation of the body's acute stress response in public speaking scenarios. It signals the release of adrenaline and the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, often occurring when an individual perceives a threat to their social standing or intellectual competence. 7 inches. This context, the threat was not physical, but existential to her political identity, the exposure of a fundamental disconnect between her rhetorical promises and the mathematical reality required to sustain them. The atmosphere within the chamber underwent a profound transition, settling into a heavy, uncomfortable, and nearly suffocating silence. This was not the silence of respect or contemplation, but rather the collective realization of a room full of experts and observers that a prominent political figure was currently operating significantly out of her intellectual depth. 1. There was a palpable shift in perception. The idea that an influential public persona, supported by tens of millions of followers and optimized by favorable media lighting, was in the process of being systematically dismantled by the cold, impartial reality of raw figures. This realization was not confined to the room. It was shared by millions of viewers across C-SPAN, CNN, and Fox News. 1. They watched in real time, as a seasoned politician struggled to reconcile a 45-minute ideological speech about a $10 trillion to $15 trillion economic transformation, with the total and glaring absence of even the most basic preliminary arithmetic. It became evident that while she had spent years advocating for legislation that her extensive staff had likely written, and she had perhaps only reviewed in summary, and while she had participated in countless interviews with friendly media hosts who never dared to ask a challenging question, she had never actually sat down with a calculator to verify if her grand vision was grounded in any form of material reality. 1. Chapter 2. The Intellectual Pedigree of Fiscal Conservatism and the Architecture of the Rhodes Scholarship. To understand the gravity of the exchange, one must first examine the divergent intellectual journeys that led these two figures to that specific witness table. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana represents a tradition of academic rigor that is often obscured by his deliberate choice of a folksy, accessible vernacular. His persona, often characterized by the country lawyer trope, serves as a rhetorical device that disarms opponents while concealing a formidable intellect. 12. However, his journey through the hallowed halls of the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar provided him with a foundation in classical economic thought that prioritizes equilibrium, scarcity, and the tangible limitations of capital. 14. The Rhodes Scholarship itself is not merely an academic accolade. It is a rigorous selection process that seeks individuals who possess both character and intellect, filtering for candidates who demonstrate moral force of character and instincts to lead. 17 inches, the quiet libraries of Oxford, particularly at Magdalen College, where he earned a first-class honors degree in civil law. 15. Kennedy mastered the nuances of macroeconomic stability. He studied under renowned legal and economic scholars, absorbing the historical lessons of hyperinflationary environments and the delicate balance required to maintain a national currency's integrity. 1. This education ingrained in him a profound respect for the mechanisms, governance, and the dangers of fiscal profligacy. His subsequent 3 decades as the state treasurer of Louisiana served as a practical laboratory for these theories. In that role, he was responsible for the actual movement of billions of dollars, the management of pension funds, and the balancing of state budgets that could not rely on the theoretical safety net of a printing press. 1. As treasurer, Kennedy oversaw a $10.6 billion investment portfolio and was instrumental in returning millions of dollars in unclaimed property to citizens, a task that required meticulous attention to detail and a granular understanding of financial flows. 16. For Kennedy, a dollar was never a mere digital abstraction. It was a unit of labor, a representation of taxpayer sacrifice, and a finite resource that required meticulous stewardship. This background created a mind that views a $1 trillion deficit not as a political talking point, but as a structural threat to the stability of the next generation. 1-inch stark contrast. The intellectual framework of the modern progressive movement, as personified by the Congresswoman, is built upon the rapid-fire dissemination of ideas in the digital age. This is an era where the speed of a message often takes precedence over its mathematical depth. Her rise was characterized by a mastery of the new media ecosystem, where complex social grievances are condensed into high-impact visual content. 1. This environment rewards passion, moral clarity, and the ability to mobilize large groups of people around a singular vision of justice. However, this same environment often lacks the mechanisms for rigorous peer review or fiscal stress testing. When she advocated for a total economic transformation, she was speaking to an audience that prioritizes the why over the how. Her background, while impressive in its grassroots organizational success, had not required her to reconcile a balance sheet under the pressure of nonpartisan auditing. The cognitive dissonance experienced during the hearing, the psychological discomfort arising from the conflict between her deeply held ideological beliefs and the contradictory mathematical evidence presented by Kennedy was palpable. 20. The calculator moment was therefore more than just a political gaffe. It was the collision of 2 entirely different eras of American intellectual life: the era of the classical economist and the era of the digital influencer. 1. Chapter 3. The Fiscal Chasm Revenue versus Reality. Senator Kennedy initiated his line of inquiry with a deceptive, almost grandfatherly friendliness, offering high praise for the Congresswoman's undeniable passion and dedication to her cause. However, he then pivoted to a request for a basic ballpark figure regarding the total capital investment required over the next 10 years to realize her agenda. Ocasio-Cortez provided an estimate suggesting the necessary investment would fall between $10 trillion and $15 trillion over a decade. 1. Kennedy with the speed of a professional treasurer, immediately calculated this as an annual federal expenditure of roughly $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. When he asked where this immense, unprecedented sum of money would originate, she responded with her standard, well-rehearsed talking points regarding a more progressive tax system, the closing of complex corporate loopholes, and the inherent fiscal flexibility supposedly provided by the tenets of modern monetary theory. Kennedy listened with practiced patience, nodding as she spoke, before pressing for specific annual revenue estimates that would be generated specifically from a proposed 70% marginal tax rate on annual income exceeding $10 million, alongside a new wealth tax on fortunes surpassing $50 million. 1. While she appeared to lack exact, verified figures in that moment, she suggested that these measures would raise several $100 billion annually. Kennedy, showing a sense of strategic generosity, rounded her estimate up to a full $500 billion. In doing so, he highlighted a glaring, massive annual shortfall of approximately $1 trillion, a fiscal gap that remained entirely unaddressed. 1. As the questioning intensified and the pressure in the room mounted, Kennedy introduced nonpartisan data sourced directly from the Congressional Budget Office, CBO. He noted that a 70% marginal rate on income over $10 million would realistically generate only approximately $43 billion per year, primarily because of the very small number of American households that actually fall into that rarefied tax bracket. 1. This assertion is supported by standard CBO scoring methods, which account for behavioral responses such as income shifting and timing changes that often reduce the effective yield of high marginal rates. 22. He continued to methodically and calmly dismantle her revenue assumptions, citing Department of the Treasury estimates, which indicated that a national wealth tax would likely raise between $200 billion and $300 billion annually. He noted that these figures assumed a state of perfect compliance and the total absence of capital flight too, conditions that he pointed out were historically unprecedented and virtually impossible in a globalized economy. After reviewing all proposed revenue streams, including significant corporate tax increases, new carbon taxes, and the aggressive closing of loopholes, the absolute total reached only about $600 billion per year. 1. This calculation exposed a massive structural annual deficit of $400 billion to $900 billion, which would be added on top of existing federal deficits. Ocasio-Cortez, visibly struggling to find a response, could not account for this discrepancy, despite her repeated claims regarding economic multiplier effects and induced macroeconomic growth. When Kennedy eventually provided the physical calculator and invited her to sum her own tax proposals herself, the resulting total of $605 billion served as a stark, undeniable confirmation of the significant shortfall against her spending goals of up to $1.5 trillion annually. 1. Kennedy emphasized that after 6 years of public advocacy and national debate, she had yet to produce a viable, mathematically sound financing plan. He stated with a somber tone that passion is simply not enough when the task at hand is the management of trillion-dollar national budgets that affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. The focus of the scrutiny then shifted toward the specific, granular mechanics of job creation. Kennedy calculated that a $1.5 trillion annual budget intended to create 2 million jobs per year resulted in a staggering cost of $750,000 per individual job. 1. He pointed out that, since the median American worker earns approximately $54,000 a year, the government could effectively pay their full salaries directly for 14 years with that amount of capital. He then asked a pointed personal question. Would she ever invest her own personal funds in a business proposal that featured such a disastrous 10-to-1 cost-to-income ratio? 1. Chapter 4. The Scandinavian Mirror. Lessons from Sweden and the Reality of Capital Flight. To further illustrate the perils of the Congresswoman's fiscal proposals, Senator Kennedy drew upon international precedents, specifically the economic history of Sweden. This segment of the inquiry was designed to challenge the often idealized invocation of the Nordic model by American progressives. Kennedy highlighted the historical fact that Sweden had repealed its own wealth tax in 2007 and significantly reformed capital taxation in 1991 because it had triggered a massive exodus of capital and ultimately cost the government more in lost revenue than it had ever generated in collections. 1. The Swedish experience serves as a cautionary tale regarding the mobility of capital in a globalized economy. Following the introduction of aggressive wealth and capital taxes, Sweden experienced substantial capital flight during the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. High net worth individuals, including iconic figures like IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad and tennis legend Bjorn Borg, relocated their assets and residences to jurisdictions with more favorable tax regimes, such as Switzerland and Monaco. 24. This exodus was not merely a loss of tax revenue. It represented a depletion of the domestic investment capital required to fuel innovation and economic growth. Kennedy referenced the Pomperipossa effect, a term derived from a satirical story written by Swedish author Astrid Lindgren in 1976. Lindgren, the creator of Pippi Longstocking, discovered that her marginal tax rate had reached 102% due to the interaction of income taxes and employer fees. Her public critique, Pomperipossa in Monismania, sparked a national debate that contributed to the fall of the Social Democratic government after 44 years in power. 26. This historical anecdote underscored Kennedy's point that tax rates have a theoretical ceiling beyond which they become counterproductive and politically unsustainable. The 1991 Swedish tax reform, known as the tax reform of the century, was a direct response to these distortions. It lowered marginal income tax rates and broadened the tax base, aiming to create a system that was neutral and efficient rather than punitive. 29. By 2007, the center-right government fully abolished the wealth tax, acknowledging that the administrative costs and the economic damage caused by capital flight outweighed any redistributive benefits. 24. Kennedy utilized these facts to question whether Ocasio-Cortez's policy goals were truly designed to maximize federal revenue, or if they were instead intended to penalize financial success at any cost. 1. He further noted that Scandinavian countries like Denmark, which she often praised, apply high marginal tax rates to individuals earning as little as $60,000, a fact that stood in stark contrast to her rhetoric about only taxing the ultra-wealthy. 1. This distinction is crucial. The Nordic model relies on broad-based taxation, where the middle class bears a significant portion of the fiscal burden, a political reality that is rarely articulated in American progressive proposals, which promise expansive benefits funded solely by the top 1%. Chapter V. The Physical Impossible Solar Volts and the Limits of Geography. One of the most devastating segments of the inquiry involved the deconstruction of the residential solar energy mandate. This portion of the discussion moved the debate from the realm of abstract finance into the realm of physical reality and engineering. The Congresswoman had frequently cited the rapid adoption of solar panels as the primary mechanism for achieving carbon neutrality. On the surface, The proposal is aesthetically and morally appealing, replacing fossil fuel consumption with the clean, infinite energy of the sun. However, the senators' use of EPA and CBO data introduced a level of material reality that the policy's proponents had seemingly ignored. 1. The math was relentless. Kennedy noted that an average residential solar system offsets approximately 4 tons of carbon dioxide annually. 1. To reach her specific target of reducing national emissions by 2 billion tons per year through residential solar alone, the United States would need to install panels on 500 million houses. However, as he pointed out, there are only about 140 million residential structures in the entire country. 1. This meant that the plan required installing solar panels on every single house in America 3.5 times over, at a projected cost of $12.5 trillion for that single component of the plan alone. 1. This calculation revealed a profound geographic illiteracy within the proposal. It assumed that every house, regardless of its location, roof orientation, or local climate, could be converted into a high-efficiency power plant. It ignored the reality of the American Northeast, where winter sunlight is scarce, or the dense urban environments where individual roof space is non-existent. The technical challenges of such a mandate are further complicated by the duck curve, a phenomenon in grid management, where solar energy overgeneration during the day causes a steep drop in net load, followed by a rapid ramp-up in demand as the sun sets. 33. Integrating such a massive influx of intermittent energy would require not just panels, but a complete overhaul of the national grid, massive investments in battery storage, and the maintenance of traditional baseload power to prevent blackouts, factors that add trillions to the cost and complexity of the transition. 3. Solar Integration Challenge Description Implication for Policy. The duck curve. A. Graphical representation of net load showing a steep drop during midday, solar peak, and rapid ramp-up at sunset. Requires massive investment in battery storage and peaker plants to balance the grid, increasing costs beyond simple panel installation. 3. 4. Grid. Inertia. Lost solar inverters do not provide the physical inertia of rotating turbines. Coal, nuclear, gas, destabilizing grid frequency. Risks widespread blackouts without expensive synchronous condensers or advanced inverter technology. 6. Material bottlenecks. The supply of silver and polysilicon is finite and currently strained. Scaling to 100%. Renewable requires mining scales that may be environmentally destructive or geopolitically impossible. 7. Geographic disparity. Solar irradiance varies wildly between the southwest, high, and northeast, low. A one-size-fits-all mandate ignores the physical reality that a panel in Seattle produces significantly less energy than one in Phoenix. 9. Furthermore, the supply chain implications of such a rapid scaling are staggering. The production of solar panels relies on critical raw materials like polysilicon and silver, supply chains that are already strained and often subject to geopolitical bottlenecks. 37. Kennedy's critique highlighted that this was not a matter of political will or moral courage, as the Congresswoman often claimed. It was a matter of physics, geology, and the physical limitations of the national housing stock. The silence that followed this revelation was perhaps the most telling moment of the hearing, as it became clear that the policy had been formulated without a basic audit of the nation's physical infrastructure. 1. Chapter 6. The Amazon HQ2 debacle, a case study in theoretical versus tangible opportunity. The senator's decision to pivot the discussion toward the Congresswoman's own district provided a localized and tangible example of the consequences of anti-math policymaking. The Amazon HQ2 project, which had been slated for Long Island City, represented a significant moment in the economic history of New York's 14th district. The project promised 25,000 high-paying jobs, billions of dollars in long-term tax revenue, and the transformation of an underutilized industrial area into a global technology hub. 1. The Congresswoman's opposition was rooted in a theoretical objection to corporate subsidies. The idea that the $3 billion in tax incentives offered by the city and state was money that could be spent elsewhere. Kennedy's critique of this position was surgically precise. He pointed out the fundamental misunderstanding of how tax incentives function. The $3 billion did not exist in a vault, waiting to be spent. It was a future discount on taxes that Amazon would only pay if they moved to the district. 1. By opposing the deal, the district did not save $3 billion to spend on schools or infrastructure. Instead, it lost the $27 billion in new tax revenue that the project was projected to generate over 2 decades. 1. Kennedy utilized data from the Regional Economic Models Incorporated (REMI) report, which had forecasted that for every $1 of incentives, the state would receive $9 in return, a fiscal multiplier that any treasurer would envy. 40. The calculator logic here was undeniable. In an area suffering from high unemployment and poverty rates significantly higher than the national average 44, the rejection of 25,000 jobs based on a misunderstanding of fiscal incentives was presented by Kennedy as a catastrophic failure of basic economic literacy. 1. Economic metrics for Amazon HQ. 2. Long Island. Projected impact. Lost. Direct jobs. Created 25,000 to 40,000 total tax revenue. 20-year. $27. 5 billion for 2. Incentive cost. Foregone revenue. $3 billion. Return on investment. ROI. $9. Returned for every $1 invested. 4. 3. Local economic context higher than average poverty. 18.6%. And unemployment in District 14. 4. This segment of the hearing reframed the Congresswoman not as a protector of the working class, but as a theorist whose lack of mathematical grounding had cost her own constituents a generational opportunity for upward mobility. It demonstrated the real-world costs of prioritizing ideological purity over pragmatic economic development. Chapter 7. The Theoretical Mirage of Modern Monetary Theory and the Inflationary Trap. The fiscal proposals presented during the hearing were largely anchored in the burgeoning school of thought known as Modern Monetary Theory, or MMT. To the uninitiated, MMT offers a seductive promise that a country which issues its own sovereign currency can never truly run out of money in the traditional sense. 1. Proponents argue that the primary constraint on government spending is not the availability of tax revenue, but rather the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services without triggering excessive inflation. In this theoretical world, the federal budget is not akin to a household budget. The government does not need to tax before it spends. Instead, it spends first and uses taxes later to regulate the money supply and control inflation. 6. This theory provided the intellectual cover for the Congresswoman's claim that trillions of dollars could be injected into the economy for national salvation with minimal fiscal friction. It allowed for the framing of massive social programs not as expenditures, but as investments that would somehow pay for themselves through a vague multiplier effect. 1. However, as Senator Kennedy methodically demonstrated, the transition from theory to practice is where the MMT framework often collapses. The fundamental flaw, as highlighted in the Senate chamber, is the assumption that the government possesses the precision to perfectly calibrate the money supply in real time. Kennedy's interrogation forced a confrontation with the reality of fiscal gravity. If the government injects $1.5 trillion annually into the economy, as her plans suggested, while only recouping $600 billion through taxation, the remaining $900 billion represents a massive increase in the monetary base. 1 inch a standard economic model, this excess liquidity, chasing a finite supply of goods and services, leads inevitably to the erosion of purchasing power. 1. When she found herself unable to explain how MMT would prevent hyperinflation without the implementation of massive, broad-based taxation, the room fell into an excruciating, heavy silence that lasted for a full 60 seconds. Kennedy challenged her fundamental understanding of MMT and its relationship to the federal budget, illustrating that her roadmap would create permanent, structural deficits ranging from 9% to 11% of the total gross domestic product. 1. The calculator moment exposed the fact that the Congresswoman had embraced the spending side of MMT without fully accounting for the taxing side required to prevent a currency crisis. By asking her to show the work on a simple retail device, Kennedy stripped away the academic jargon of MMT and revealed the underlying structural deficit that would, in a real-world scenario, likely lead to the very economic instability she sought to prevent. This critique echoed the concerns of mainstream economists and former Treasury secretaries who have warned that ignoring the inflation risk inherent in MMT is a form of luxury belief held by those insulated from the consequences of currency devaluation. 6. Conclusion. The legacy of Arithmetic Kennedy concluded the hearing by stating that if a legislator cannot answer elementary arithmetic questions about their own flagship proposal, it may not be a serious policy at all, but rather just a charismatic slogan. 1. The aftermath of this hearing represented a tectonic, fundamental shift in the American political landscape. The calculator moment achieved instant, unprecedented virality across every major social media platform, garnering over 60 million views in the first 48 hours and becoming the primary trending topic globally. Media outlets across the entire political spectrum struggled to find a way to defend her performance. Even ideologically aligned economists were forced to concede that good intentions and noble goals are insufficient without the presence of rigorous, defensible mathematical modeling. Within a matter of weeks, public support for the Green New Deal, which had once been a dominant policy framework, cratered from 58% to a mere 39%. This sharp decline in public opinion was corroborated by polling data, which indicated that while the abstract goals of the Green New Deal enjoyed broad support, the specific mechanisms and costs, once exposed, were deeply unpopular. 8. Furthermore, a serious primary challenge emerged in the form of Marcus Rodriguez, a pragmatic candidate whose campaign launch video focused entirely on the vital importance of doing the math, and garnered 5 million views in its first day. Although Ocasio-Cortez narrowly survived her primary election, the experience changed her. She became far more cautious, detail-oriented, and measured in her subsequent policy claims. 1 year after the event, the Green New Deal was effectively dead in its original, expansive form, replaced by a series of more realistic, incremental, and fiscally grounded climate proposals. The ultimate and enduring legacy of the hearing was the widespread national realization that governance, at its most fundamental level, is an exercise in arithmetic. It served as a reminder that passion, rhetoric, and massive social media followings are no substitute for the cold, hard reality of mathematical certainty. In the collision between the digital age's preference for narrative and the analog world's requirement for solvency, the simple plastic calculator proved to be the most powerful instrument in the room.